My pleasure to introduce. It is my pleasure to introduce you a man whose story is the essence of human resilience and spirit of hope. Dr. Robert Wolf is a radiologist, author, and dedicated historian of his family's legacy. He will share the remarkable story and journey of his father, Ervin Wolf, which is chronicled in his multi award winning biography, Not a Real Enemy: The True Story of a Hungarian Jewish Man's Fight for Freedom. This book is not just a memoir, is a testament to the power of determination against the dark forces of Nazism and the oppressive shadows of communism that followed. Dr. Wolf's tale is deeply personal. Growing up in Michigan, the complexity of his parents' past in Hungary seemed worlds away. And we will hear in the only later in life, when the stories his father shared, that he came to fully grasp the magnitude of their experiences during and after the Holocaust. These revelations became the foundation of his book and the driving force behind his mission to illuminate one of history's darkest times. In April, the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy from Oxford, England, hosted his book presentation. The same week, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., hosted a 2-day book signing and asked him to return again soon. Please welcome a man who first reached out to me after the announcement of my first post about being president of the Golden Gate Breakfast Club. So please welcome Dr. Robert Wolf. And Pete, if you can please keep me spotlighted for the slides.
Well, thank you for inviting me while you're getting the slides going. I appreciate the invitation. Special thank you to Patricia for spending the extra time with me on Monday, and for the invitation. To Suzanne as well for helping organize this book presentation, and indeed thank you to the Golden Gate Breakfast Club. I appreciate the opportunity to share my dad's story. So that said, when I was growing up in Michigan in the 60s and 70s, I couldn't comprehend my parents as having lives before I was born. I knew they'd come from Hungary, and I knew they'd fled Europe after the war, and that my dad's parents had been killed, but Hungary seemed as far away as World War II, and I didn't have much interest. As I grew, I came to learn about the Holocaust, and I knew it was horrible, and I knew my parents had been right in the middle of it, but still, it was a world so abstract to me that I couldn't comprehend it, so I didn't. My parents never talked about their younger lives that much. My mother, Judith, was a homemaker, happy to cook and care for me, and devoted her life to her family. And of course, religious organizations such as ORT and our temple sisterhood, while educating people about history and the Holocaust. I couldn't imagine her having a life outside her family. As for my father, Ervin Wolf, he was a joyful, enthusiastic, energized, and charismatic guy. I knew he was clever. After all, he was a doctor. And as a respected obstetrician, all I could imagine of my dad was his life devoted to bringing life into the world. Their lives before my birth hadn't really impacted me, not until I was grown, and my dad began to tell me more about what had happened in those wartime years. It was only then that the horrors of the Holocaust went from a history lesson that my parents had survived to a shocking realization of just what had truly happened to them. Far worse, I began to realize the devastating truth of how my grandparents had risen to a life of wealth and great social respect, only to be brutally murdered by the Nazis just for the crime of being Jewish. Yet, as my father revealed a story to me, which my parents and I recorded over many years, as I listened and took detailed notes, what struck me beyond the tragedy was how inspiring and miraculous his story turned out to be. The congenial and witty doctor that I knew was not the ordinary man I thought my father to be. He was a man who had outwitted the Nazis, escaping from their imprisonment not once, but twice, a man who endured unspeakable loss, who survived on his wits while hiding out in a series of secret buildings and secret rooms, who engaged in outlandish adventures, and then, when he thought it was all over and he could finally live as a free man at last, the communists took over, and he found himself engaged in a series of cloak and dagger escapades as he set out to escape Europe once and for all. In my book, Not a Real Enemy, the true story of a Hungarian Jewish man's fight for freedom, I tell my father's story. I don't want to give too much away because I hope you'll read about his journey and find it as amazing as I did, but I do want to talk about some of the feelings his story inspired. The first is loneliness. We all know what it is to feel alone, even when surrounded by others. I can't imagine how lonely my dad must have felt when he was forced to leave his family at the age of 19. He'd never even spent a night without them, and after his first escape from the forced labor camp, after a long and clumsy all-out foot race for his own freedom, forced to hide for hours in the cold and wintry thicket of the Caspian foothills, I have no doubt my dad was scared and lonely. He was just a kid who knew that he'd be killed if he was caught, and so he risked being eaten alive by bears or wolves rather than risk another night of the guards' brutality. Yet loneliness was something he knew well. As he was growing up in Hungary, an only child, he was bullied for being a Jew, for not being Jewish enough when he lived among the Orthodox, for living in the wrong neighborhood, for not fitting in. Let me read to you an excerpt from the book when my father had just arrived at the labor camp and recognizes a friend from school. Thank God for Frank, Ervin thought. He had never needed anyone like he felt he needed Frank at that moment. Frank would not just be a familiar face in the midst of this horrible ordeal. His common sense and leadership were just the thing Ervin needed now that he was under the control of these brutes. A friend like Frank could help him get through it, he was certain. The question was, what did he have to offer Frank besides mere friendship? He'd prayed he'd find the answer because in that flicker of a second in which he recognized Frank's face through the stable's darkness, the intensity of his need for just such a friend swept over him. I'll be damned, Ervin called out to his old friend, Frank Moore. Come here, I've got something for you. And with that, he unwrapped all he had to offer, a few crescent cookies and some cold pierogies. It wasn't much, but in that cold and lonely moment in a stable built for livestock, it was the most generous gift Ervin could provide to the friend who gave him more than mere camaraderie. Having Frank beside him gave him hope he would survive. After the war, as the communists watched his every move, listened in on his private conversations, monitored his movements, imprisoned his friends and colleagues, turning one against the other, recruiting spies among his fellow medical students, and then among his colleagues, he learned to remain silent. Even after marrying my mother, who was herself a medical student, they were forced into a solitude together. No one could be trusted, yet no one could survive alone. One lesson I learned from my father was that loneliness is a part of the human condition, but it needn't mark us as outsiders. We must depend on others, even as we do so with caution. Our loneliness is an existential state, but ultimately we are inextricably linked to the lives and fates of others, and importantly, we are ultimately never alone. God is by our side every step of the way, even in our most isolating moments. Another feeling my father's story brings up is humiliation. Day by day, the indignities my dad, his family, and friends endured mounted. They were told where to stand and how to stand, where to live and how to live, denied the right to own a radio, denied the right to practice medicine, denied the right to work. For my father's father, these humiliations came after years of struggle to become a doctor, to acquire wealth, to raise his family in a grand home where they were well respected. But no sooner had he achieved these honors that they were chipped away. First, he was told he could not practice medicine, so he became a dentist. Then he was told he could not work, and that his son must be sent to hard labor, that he could not mix with the Gentiles, that he must wear that ridiculous yellow star marking him as unworthy, and ultimately that he could not live. My father's own humiliations mounted, but he would not let his humiliation define him. He refused to embrace the identity the Nazis and later the communists tried to impose upon him. Each of us has endured our own humiliations, and yet how they pale in comparison to what our Jewish ancestors endured. How much stronger we become when we accept our humiliation as a test of our endurance, of our own sense of who we are and our place in society. Only by forging our own identities do we cast off those identities others may confer upon us. Here's another excerpt from a scene in the labor camp where my father had been subjected to repeated humiliations and abuse. Though the men had hoped that over time the guards would be kinder to them, once they got to know them and saw them as fellow men, the opposite proved true. It was as if the more the guards came to know the men, the more emboldened they became to abuse them, perhaps because they had learned that no act, no matter how brutal, would be punished, whereas any kindness they showed would be. Whatever the cause, the guards delighted in their cruelty. When the men were working in the deep wells, the guards would amuse themselves by urinating on them, turning the holes they dug into veritable latrines. Yet the humiliation didn't bother the men so much because the more they were peed on, the more satisfied the guards were that they had inflicted sufficient degradation on their charges, thereby lessening the chance of a beating. It was the beatings the men feared the most. There's also the theme of integrity, which is alive on every page. My father would never have survived had he not had integrity. Throughout the book, my father's integrity and that of several others proves to be the saving grace that kept him and others alive. My grandfather, as well, proved to be a man of integrity, and many scenes show how his integrity, which in the end could not save him nor my grandmother, saved the life of his son, if not directly, then indirectly by how he had raised my father. When Dad had been sent to the labor service, my grandparents were worried that he would not survive because he'd been so spoiled, had no experience with hard work. But they underestimated how far integrity would take Ervin, who came to realize that it wasn't just his own life that was at stake, but that of his friends and fellow prisoners. His determination that no one would die because of his actions, his failures, or his mistakes compelled my father to find the strength to carry on, to work harder, and to rise above the horror. Because of his integrity, others learned to trust my dad, and because of the integrity of others, he survived. In our own world today, it's easy to despair, but I'll bet there's not one of you who hasn't been blessed by the integrity of another, who hasn't demonstrated your own integrity when it most mattered. Learning my father's story inspired in me to always act with integrity and to live up to his own high standards of how we treat each other and ourselves. Another excerpt. As they reached the town center, the men noticed masses of marching military columns, occasionally interrupted by armored trucks or horse-drawn wagons. The striking difference between the two, one a symbol of power and might and igniting fear in the hearts of the men, the other a symbol of simplicity and self-reliance, conjuring peace and safety, if not a world before the war, caused the men to reassess whether they ought to be so bold as to approach anyone at all. The alternative is we become thieves just to eat, Ervin said, and I'd rather bank on people having a good heart than darkening my own. I'm with you, Frank said, as he was a man of integrity himself, but we need to be careful. Agreed, Ervin said, just as a couple of well-dressed men came out of a building they were passing. Good afternoon, soldiers, one of the men said, tipping his hat. The other did the same, and no sooner had Ervin and Frank returned the greeting than one of the men asked, "What brings you to our town? We don't have many soldiers out here other than those trucks and tanks that pass us by." Ervin gave them their cover story, which promptly brought more questioning. The more he answered their questions, Frank stepping back and keeping conspicuously quiet so as not to contradict or confuse the explanation, the more nervous Ervin became. What had become a friendly greeting was quickly advancing to a suspicious interrogation. "Look," the more vocal one said in a lowered tone, stepping away from the street and closer to the building as if it were a safer place to be, away from the passersby. "No one gets lost out here. You're Jews, and you've made a run for it." Finally, there's hope. My father was a soft-spoiled only child who hadn't done a lick of work in his life. He didn't even have to make his own bed. There was a maid to do that. When he was sent to the Nazi-controlled labor service, a brutal work camp for Jews who were considered too inferior for national service and only fit for the most arduous, unpleasant tasks, like digging deep ditches in the dead of winter, laying the ground for an airport strip with their bare hands, marching across the country in scorching heat or icy winters, all with barely enough food to keep them alive. Another excerpt. As time went on, small graces helped the men to endure the realities of their fate. Ervin learned from Mike's father, who inexplicably was allowed a rare visit and brought news from the outside world that the guards could be bribed. Though the guards never spoke directly to the men unless it was to deliver orders or rebukes, and never looked them in the eye, through the small acts of bribery, a silent contract had developed. Some young men received a bit more food, a few less punishments, even extra clothing. Fortunately, it wasn't long before Ervin learned that his own father had met with the guards, offering free dental treatment for their families, as well as cash, and Ervin received a visit from one of the guards not long after. Wolf! Ervin sprang to attention, ready to withstand whatever was coming. He looked up and saw Janos, the guard who'd served them sausages at the earlier camp, jerk his head for Ervin to come to him. Ervin complied, standing at attention before the funny-looking man. Janos had tiny eyes buried in a face so pockmarked he almost looked like a burn victim. He was quite hideous, but Ervin concluded it may have been his ugliness which rendered him more sympathetic than the other guards. Still, he was a guard, and Ervin had long since concluded that even the kindest of guards held power over him, and no one holds power without employing it. Thus, when Janos commanded Ervin to approach, Ervin was as cautious as he was obedient. Your parents want you to have this, he said, his voice low and neither kind nor cruel. He handed Ervin a small paper packet as discreetly as if he were passing a valet a well-earned tip, and then turned and barked orders to a nearby group of men. Ervin used the diversion to sneak back to his bunk and open the packet. Inside was a chain of gold with a simple four-leaf clover charm, a small ruby embedded in the center. Ervin had never before received jewelry from his parents, but this golden four-leaf clover was the most treasured gift he'd ever opened, not for being gold, but for being a symbol of their optimism and hope that he'd be home soon. He turned the charm over and saw that they had the charm engraved. In remembrance from your parents, 1943 X4. A tear fell from Ervin's face, followed by another, then another. 1943, the year he had last seen his family. X was the Roman numeral for the month of October, and 4 for the day he departed just a few months earlier. The tears fell heavily now as he realized how momentous that day had been and how much that date was etched not just upon the golden charm, but also upon his parents' hearts. Coincidentally, or possibly not, my bar mitzvah was on October 4th, 32 years later. The despair my father and his fellow laborers felt was palpable, but amid that despair, deep and lasting bonds were formed with his friends and fellow prisoners, and small tokens like a simple kindness, a shared bit of food, a funny story late at night, brought the comfort and glimmer of hope that each needed to endure the unendurable. In these troubled times in our own nation, times that in some ways echo the early days of the rise of fascism, and in other ways don't even come close, we would do well to embrace that hope. We live surrounded by comforts and kindness, yet how easily we lose sight of all that we have. Reading stories like that of my father can teach us to find hope in the darkest moments. For my father, hope kept him alive when he felt dead. Hope kept him going, giving him the courage he needed to dare his most dangerous escapes, and hope gave him the certainty that his pain would pass. We are living in troubling times, and the rise of anti-Semitism in our nation and across the globe is shockingly great. Whether the rise of anti-Semitism or the Hungarian Revolution in 1956 that my father quite literally stumbled upon as he made his way home, the lessons of the past are alive and with us. Let's think about these lessons as we live our lives in freedom. I do hope you'll read my father's story, because I have no doubt that you'll find in his story the same inspiration that he brought to me, inspiring me to never give up hope, to live a life of integrity, to never let anyone else shame or define me, and to never forget that while life comes with tragedies, some so great that they are unspeakable, our future is our own to make. I'd like to tell you that once the Nazis were gone, Ervin's life got better. And though he did get into medical school, finally, and he did find employment as an obstetrician, life under the communists proved to be another challenge. There's a saying, the crocodiles have gone, but the alligators have arrived. And I think that pretty much sums up what was going on in Hungary during those years. Dad even paraphrased, out of the frying pan into the fire. One only needs to look at Ukraine to realize that things haven't changed much, eh? In closing, I'd like to leave you with these thoughts. Although few people know the story of what happened to the Hungarian Jews during the Holocaust, nearly 500,000 were deported, as my grandparents were, most going straight to Auschwitz where they were killed. Almost all who survived were the ones like my father who were serving in the deplorable labor camps where beatings, starvation, and death marches were common. In Not a Real Enemy, I've tried to tell the story of the Hungarian Jews during the Holocaust and their fate under Stalin's communism. Every Jew who lived there during those times has their own story to tell, and this is just one among over 825,000 Jews who lived in Hungary prior to the war. As my father's story shows, there are fine lines between good and evil, war and peace, love and hate, hope and despair, tolerance and prejudice, right and wrong. I wish that the lines were thicker rather than so fine, but I'm immensely proud to know where my family stood. Through all of those harrowing years, my father exhibited immeasurable determination to not only survive against steep odds, but also, once he had survived such unspeakable atrocities, once he learned of his parents' fates and the fates of so many other people he cared about, either during the reign of the Nazis or the reign of the communists, Dad was determined not to be destroyed. The very fact of his survival became a pledge to God and to the memory of his parents to fully live his life. When I started out on this journey 6 years ago, I had no idea what I was getting into, despite the many stories that my parents shared with me and others. And I hope I have done their story and history justice. And I do hope that you'll read the book, to read the story, and share your thoughts with me, because I want my father's story to do more than entertain you. I want it to inspire you in these difficult times so that you will know, just as my father came to know, that you're stronger than you realize, and our nation is as well. Thank you so much for your time and attention, and I'd be happy to hear from you. Questions, comments, please.
Well, thank you very much. That was very inspiring. I will take I'll ask the first question as I have the chair, as it were. When did your father and how did your father start telling you these stories? And I say that because my Uncle Bill spent all of World War II in a prisoner of war camp, and he never mentioned any of the stories till 2001. He didn't tell his wife, his children, his father, his brothers. So I'd like to know how the conversation began. And now, Pete, if you can unspotlight me, I'll just become a regular audience member, please.
That's such a great question, and I can't pinpoint the exact time, but it sort of puts me to the history of the book. Literally, the first half of my life, like I said, I didn't really think much about it. I was busy going to school, trying to practice radiology, having a family. Slowly over time, they started talking about the stories. Dad never showed any signs of PTSD, jovial and jolly. They wrote the stories in the 1970s, paper and pencil, as clear as they had happened the previous day. Then it went to typewriter, to computer, to disc. Over that time, I read the manuscript maybe once. I didn't think much of it. I remembered my dad's first escape. He had four, but that was the one I remembered the most, and forgot about most of the rest of the book. Um, and then my mom was a Holocaust educator too, and educator in history in general. They were very well-rounded people. They were into the arts and the sciences, museum, travel, education, not just history. My mom might have had a little bit of PTSD, but she fought it out by educating people. There's no right way. I know that we talk about Vietnam and PTSD and imprisonment and PTSD. There's no right or wrong way for somebody to talk about their history. Some people never talk about it at all. Some people share about it every day. My mom started to share about it more and more frequently the second half of my life. Maybe I got a little bit of Holocaust fatigue, maybe not. She used to tell the wife and the family and friends about it, but it was important to her and important to them. Finally, my dad died in 1997, unfortunately. My mom died in 2016, unfortunately. And a historian friend handed me the disc. The book is now on a disc. And even then, I didn't think much of it because I was busy taking care of my mom's affairs. I retired for a year. And then a friend of mine asked me to come back to work to help him with some radiology. And that brought me back to the disc. When we practice radiology, we've got two screens. The left screen is the patient list, and the right screen is the images. So in between cases, I looked at my dad's autobiography. We're now at 2018, by the way. And on the right side, I dictated his biography as precisely as I could, just to as much fidelity as I could. And then we went from there. And the inspiration, the motivation of doing that was clearly there. The background of anti-Semitism throughout the book. And my dad made clear what his message was. And I swear they wrote this story knowing that I would do this. And don't you just hate it when your parents are right? At least back when we were kids. Excellent question.
All right. Well, good. Thank you very much. And Good. Yeah, let's give him a little applause. And Janelle, you just wrote a comment. Would you like to say that? Unmute, Janelle.
There we go. Somebody should invent something that lets us know more precisely when we're muted. It's got to be a better invention on Zoom for this. I think every family has pain in it, has history of their pain, and the world is filled with it. I've been very fascinated over the years with what the Japanese experienced with the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Most of those people were quite innocent of what the Japanese government and military were foisting on the world. The Japanese don't talk about that either. They don't know what their grandparents went through with the bombing of those two cities. And it's a real shame that it happens, but I think it's because these people do experience, they remember what they went through and experience shame for that. It's the only thing I can think of as to why they don't share more of what went on. And then I look at my own life and my grandparents who came from Europe to the United States and lived in great poverty in the United States until they were able to make something of their families, and they never talked about it either. I mean, that shame is such a condition that just zips people's mouths shut, and they won't talk about it. I mean, what kind of women like to talk about being raped? What kind of women today are willing to talk about what happens with abortion issues? We're so reluctant to share that shame as if it's ours instead of something that was put on us. So I really appreciate what you're saying.
That's such a great point. I mean, not the stereotype, but notoriously the Japanese culture tends to be more stoic, less smiling. And this is what I was taught about a long time ago. I do have a lot of Asian friends, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, so I'm not stereotyping, but stoic. Mm-hmm. But yeah, the idea of shame is really there. If you're Jewish, or back in the days, with the racism with the African Americans, if you're told you're bad long enough, you start to believe it. And I think that's where my dad was, that people, oh, you're Jewish, you're no good, you can't do this, you can't do that. And you start to believe it. You get this feeling of learned helplessness. And how my dad overcame all that with everything he went through and became an OBGYN and delivered thousands of babies with a big smile on his face, it's unbelievable. It's so inspiring. It's called redemption. And that was his method of fighting it off. Not everybody gets that. A lot of people get manic depression, or they turn to the bottle or drugs, or commit suicide, or have other serious psychological consequences like anxiety. It's a great point. It's sad when you're the victim, and it's so hard to fight your way out of it. And rape is a good analogy too. I mean, and torture, imprisonment, human trafficking, anything like that. And I don't even know. And the thing about my book too is I don't know how I would react if I had to live the life that my father did, because I've worked hard all my life, but I was born into a good family with nurturing parents and lucky, and I never take that for granted. And after doing this story, even less so. But shame is a good way. It's learned helplessness, and that's just, it's at a point that it's well taken. I mean, not everybody gets through it like my parents did.
Right. And if you don't work through that shame, it just sticks with you. You suffer from the PTSD, but it's there.
All right, as your president, let me acknowledge some of our late members: Douglas Bauer, Mike Milstein, Derek Arden, and Carl Walsh. Carl got home just a few hours ago from Hawaii. All right, and there's Derek. Derek, I acknowledge you all the way from England. Did you want to make a question or comment to our guest?
No, a very good presentation. Thank you very much. Greetings from the other side of the pond.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Thank you.
All right. Oh yes, Susan Rowan, you have a question.
I can't help but listen, know what's going on, and be so disturbed, Dr. Wolf, because so much of what is happening today worldwide is analogous to many of the points that you made that your dad went through. And I just wondered if it calls up for you when you see what's going on, whether it's Poland or France or the Sudan or here, if it calls up anything like from your father's story.
Well, after October 7th, my slippery slope of the battle went from this to this because that feeling of hate just increased. And another thing about the learned helplessness is that being told you were a Jew all these years and no good made my dad feel, well, maybe they're right, but that's not really how he felt. He felt proud of his religion. But on the other hand, he felt accountability. If there's malfeasance performed by another individual, they're accountable for it, whether Jewish or not. And so my dad would be tougher on Jewish malfeasance than others. That aside, the history is repeating itself. It's doing it again and again. We never learn. I'm doing my little corner to battle anti-Semitism. I can't do it alone. There's a nice handful of people that are doing it. Fortunately, the vast majority of the free world aligns with people like us. And my goal is to get more people to buy into it. Now, I'm not going to convince Hamas to not hate Israel and America and the Jews, or Iran or North Korea. That's not going to happen. And I don't intend to. But people that are on the fence, or people that I need to actively fight the battle, that's sort of my goal, my little corner of it. And I do it in my own little way. I'm not a professional historian, but I've become one. I'm not a professional English major, but I've become one. And with that, this is my charge. And I've been zapped with it. And this is what I'm doing now. So it's appalling. It's disgusting. And scapegoating is the other thing. Accountability goes with scapegoating. And we had it in 9/11. The scapegoats were the Muslim population. But we all remember 9/11, which is actually still denied by some of these kids that probably weren't even born yet. They're denying 9/11. 9/11 was American targets, Asians, Jewish, Christian, Muslim. 3,000 people died, and countless illnesses and the property destruction and cost, on and on and on. The cost of travel alone, I mean, just it's skyrocketed. So, and then the other thing was with the COVID, the Asian population were scapegoats then. So, and then we have October 7th. It's just ignorance to me. It's a lack of education in my mind, and that's where I'm trying to change things. It's just educating people. I'm Jewish. My friends are Jewish. My friends are Christian. I'm a doctor. My dad was a doctor. His dad was a dentist. We were contributing people to society. I have nothing to do with Gaza. I have nothing to do with Hitler or 9/11. But I do my part to be a normal American, work hard, love my neighbor, be a little bit philanthropic, and live by more than just food, water, shelter, and clothing. You know, educate people, do something above and beyond, do something a little bit to help make this world a little bit better.
All right, good. The next question from Randall Reeder.
Okay, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong on what I'm getting at here. I believe in the late 1930s and even at the beginning of the World War II that we did not recognize the plight of the Jewish people in Germany and Europe. I recall that a shipload of Jewish people was rejected from New York by President Roosevelt. The owner of the New York Times, Jewish, had their main correspondent in Germany that did not tell the truth. Now, and coming to currently the situation with the riots on college campuses, one of the main financial supporters of that seems to be George Soros, who I think is Jewish, and probably other Jewish folks also. Any comment as you're talking about things are continuing today, just like they were in history, and we don't seem to learn. So anyway, what's your comments on that?
Well, your knowledge of history is excellent. I mean that you've nailed it. And like I said in the talk, some of the things are comparable, and some of the things are. And the thing that isn't is it's not as pervasive as it was in the rise of Nazi Germany. At least not yet, thank God. I think we have enough normalcy with politics. I don't like to get political. I'm not political anyway. So our sense of normalcy is there, and hopefully we can fight it off that way. But you are right. The Jewish people, there is certain apathy in some Jewish people, and it's all about whether it affects you or not. If you're in your tall tower and you're living the good life, and you've got security and bodyguards and plenty of money to get in a helicopter and go from point A to point B without trouble, then it's not going to affect you. So why would you fight it? That's where the effort comes in. That's where I'm sending books to people like Bob Kraft, who's also an active philanthropist, and who's also he's pro Israel and pro peace and pro education. So well said. We need to recruit. I didn't know that about the New York Times editor, but it's well said. And then unfortunately, these African-American superstars like professional athletes and musicians, when they're talking about anti-Semitism or giving anti-Semitic, that to me is that's disheartening. That to me is very, it's disgusting. And because it wasn't like that in the 60s with MLK. And I wish people would follow the words and the actions of people like MLK and Gandhi and Moses. I'm not pretending to be any of those people, but those are my heroes. And I follow them and their thoughts more than some of the other rubbish that we hear day to day on social media and elsewhere. So very well said. Yes, we need more Jewish people and Christians and Muslims even. And I'm seeing some of it with the Muslims now when they see all this the senseless destruction in Gaza. But yeah, it takes everybody. It's not just me and you. It takes a lot of people.
I just have to jump in here. I heard Soros's name, and I want to make sure that I understood what you said. First of all, the Sulzbergers haven't been Jewish in decades, and the Kristallnacht was on page 9 of the New York Times. So you're right about that. If you look, you will see that there is a list since 2012 of what organizations have donated to the organizing of the pro-Palestinian, and it's billions of dollars from Arab countries, etc. But I'm hoping we're not blaming George Soros for what's going on the campuses, because it's way beyond him.
That's a great people blaming politicians for their own problems or the problems of our nation or neighbors. That's a lack of accountability. I agree with you. If I can't get protection from my own police and my own government, then I have a right to criticize them because I will not feel safe. But I don't want to blame any single person. It's the concept, and I don't know if Soros is Jewish or not, but I do know that he's Hungarian. But there are a lot of good Hungarians in this country too.
He was born Jewish.
What's that?
He was born Jewish.
Oh, I didn't know that. I don't know if he converted or not, but there's other the CEO of Intel, the CEO of the Interactive Brokers. Those are Hungarian people too, and they seem like normal, law-abiding, God-fearing people as well. And we need more of those. Yeah, Soros is a little difficult. I've heard things, but again, he's not the only one. You can compare him to Henry Ford back in the day, and who was the famous pilot? They just did a movie about him a few years ago. I can't think of his name. Lindbergh, famous anti-Semitic people. Jane Fonda, and funding Palestinian. Let's see, peaceful Palestinians, hardworking Palestinians. They have a right to exist. I mean, there's no doubt about it. How they're going to work that out is between Israel and them. It's got nothing to do with me. But we can have our say and our opinion. But when it comes to murder and rape and malfeasance and kidnapping, that you've crossed the line, and that's more Hamas. That's more terrorism. And we can go back through the history of terrorism since 1948. We can go back into the Old Testament and talk about terrorism and the battle. And I don't know if it's ever going to go away, but if we can curtail it one way or another, it would be super.
All right, good. We have a question from Douglas Bauer and then Janelle Barlow.
Thank you, Patricia. Dr. Wolf, in Los Angeles, we have 2 major universities who are in semi-lockdown, and a graduation ceremony for the University of USC has been put off or has been canceled. And the mechanism, what seems to be going on is I'm right, you're wrong. And it doesn't matter about any facts. It doesn't matter about circumstance. It's I'm right, you're wrong. Would you like to comment about that as far as what's going on here? It seems to be repetitive of all the things your dad experienced.
Oh, it's very sad to me. And I think it's up to those professors, the leaders, to educate the kids in the right way. And if they're not doing that, I don't think they're doing their job. If they're not telling the truth that's coming right from written text for hundreds and thousands of years, they're not doing their job. And it's a little late now. I mean, finally, they're doing things at Columbia. finally they sort of squelched it at Harvard and Tufts, my alma mater in Michigan. Very sad to see that in California. I know it's a very populated state, and it's horrible. You can fly me in there, and I'll be happy to do a presentation to all those kids. I'll talk to every one of them and get them in the room. I'll be happy to. So that's about what I can do. I mean, and all the other thing is talk to your politicians. I mean, I've reached out to the politicians down here, often on deaf ears, unfortunately, even Jewish ones, and that really makes me sad. But that's the one way to talk to your politicians and say enough is enough. I was really appalled when I heard that 65-year-old man was stabbed to death because he was Jewish, not long after October. That was in Los Angeles, if I'm not mistaken. And somebody said they were a Berkeley alum, and I heard it's still going on in Berkeley too. So these kids just don't know. I mean, they don't know history, and like you said, they're just following along like sheep, and not realizing what it is. And I'm going back to education, the lectures, and help with that.
All right, and let us please move our questions back to Dad's story. All right, Janelle, your question.
Yes, I really appreciate that you're here and talking about this. And I think how fortunate the world has been for all the unfortunate that happened to Jews in Europe and how they moved to other countries. My husband, who is Jewish, will be watching television. He constantly was, that guy's Jewish. And then we look them up, and sure enough, they are. And, you know, how we have benefited in this country from the Jewish population. And this is just a comment. I don't know if you're aware of this, but right now in Mexico, there's the election for the president going on, and there are 2 women running for the president. They're going to have a female president in Mexico, which is hard to believe. And the woman who is likely to win came from that group of Jews who moved to Mexico, which most of us are not aware of. But there's a section in Mexico City that is extremely wealthy. It's basically the Jewish section of Mexico City. And none of them they don't really identify as Jews, but they are Jewish, and they know that. But the contribution that they have made to Mexico is tremendous. And we're going to get to see that with a Jewish Mexican female president in the next few months. And I just think that's incredibly tremendous.
I think it's great too. Like, I would have voted for Lieberman back in the day, but a Jewish president would have been unheard of back in the day. I remember Shirley Chisholm running for president. It may happen. I'll tell you what, we need a Golda Meir, great movie, by the way, great story, or an Indira Gandhi or a Margaret Thatcher, in my opinion, and I would be happy. I'm those type of leaders I would climb on board with. The kid up north in Canada, he's clueless, and Canada's almost worse than. I've got cousins in Toronto. They're Orthodox, hardworking, nice men, and I just had a conversation with one of them, and it's horrendous what's going on up there. And I wish people would wake up and realize they part of it is immigration, part of it's illegal immigration, and part of it is lack of education and not going through the channels they need to. But yeah, all eyes will be on Mexico. I didn't know that, but during this journey, there's a lot of things I've learned about the Jewish diaspora, like the help from in Hong Kong and Asia, and also a lot of Jewish people I've met from Cuba and South America down here in Florida. And it's really inspiring. It's wonderful to talk to these people and exchange ideas and know that there are good people out there. And I hope whoever wins that election is successful. Mexico is still a friend of the United States, and I hope it stays that way forever. And that's about all I can say. When is the election? November or
something like that?
All right, Robert. Now,
okay, I'm sorry. Oh, go ahead.
Robert, can you tell us a story about the first time your dad escaped?
Oh, sure. Yeah, my dad. Okay, so my dad had a foot infection. I want to make sure I got this right. My dad had a lot of pestilence during the time. It wasn't just being beaten and urinated on and tortured, and other times they random threats of murder, just random threats of murder by drunk officers. I mean, that was while they're still in the forced labor camp. My dad had a foot infection or injury. He described it as an infection, ends up in a hospital. And that may have saved his life because he was not in the forced labor camp for a couple of days. By the way, the doctor said to him, and this is horrible, and my dad quoted this, the doctor said to him, "It's not going to matter if your foot heals or not, you're going to be dead soon anyway." That's what the doctor told him in the hospital. Can you believe that? So he gets but they may have saved his life. And another time he had food poisoning, probably for some bad milk, and he had to go to a hospital. And a Christian, it was a nun or a very highly religious Christian lady, helped recognize that this man is sick and he needs help. And that was another miracle that he got out of the forced labor camp for a couple of days. But so when he gets back from the hospital, he and his friend Frank decide that they're marching again. The war is coming to an end. They don't know whether it's safe to be as Jews, whether it's safer to be in Austria or Hungary. They didn't know, because it might have depended on who won the war. If the Nazis won the war, Austria is not safe. If the communists win the war, then that may not be safe either. So, but the idea was they had this gut feeling that it was going to be a death march, and it was the middle of the winter, and they just decided they had about a 3-day window to decide when they were going to escape. And sure enough, they planned it out quietly. They tried to stay in the front of the line or the back of the line, where they were farthest away from the guards as possible. And they decided to take off just a few minutes before dusk, so they'd be hard to find. And they just ran and ran and ran the wintry thicket, the foothills, hiding in prickly bushes, breathing heavy, and just praying that no one would find them. And sure enough, guards went after them, and a third man escaped too. So I'll give you that. And they caught the third man. And my dad and Frank decided that they should run in separate directions. Okay, that was part of their thing. And Frank thought that he was deserting him. He thought he was, oh, we're going all this far, and now you're not going to hang out with me. You're going to just go your own way. And he just thought it was to protect both of them. If one of them got caught, at least the other one would escape. And I thought that would have been a great plan. So meanwhile, they escape, and then they think they're going their separate ways, and a third man follows behind them. Well, the third man got caught. And while they're hiding, they hear him beat this guy and drag him back to wherever they had to go. And while I'm sure their hearts were pounding in their throats. I mean, I can't imagine that. And meanwhile, you're worried about other animals getting to you at the same time. You're bleeding, you're cold, you're scared. And finally, it quieted down. And after hours of just waiting there, unbelievably, his friend Frank was within a few yards of him. So they thought they had separated, but in fact they hadn't. So they got back to Budapest together with whatever back routes they could take along the railroad tracks, side roads, and in the mountains themselves. And they finally made it back to Budapest. And then there were twists and turns there before their second escape too. It's an exciting chapter. It really put yourself in my dad's place when you read about how he escaped. It's you feel like, how would I do this? How fast could I run? How would I get out? How would I do this and not get caught? And where am I going? Where's the light at the end of the tunnel? Where's my next meal? Where am I going to live? What are my parents doing? I mean, we talk about that light at the end of the tunnel. It doesn't happen throughout much of this book. There's no light at the end of the tunnel. You don't know where you're heading. All you know, you're on the run and you're just trying to survive.
All right. Do we have any other questions, comments, observations?
Doug has his hand raised. Doug Bauer.
Yeah, but we called on Doug once. Is this a new hand, Doug, or the same old hand?
It's another observation in a similar way.
Okay, well, let's talk to people who haven't been acknowledged first. So, Tim Durkin.
Yes, Dr. Wolf, incredible story of you, your dad, and your grandfather. The thing that is most disturbing about the current times, and I know you reach out across all religions and ethnicities, that no Christian should be standing by and allowing anti-Semitism to exist or even to flourish. Because at the base and at the core, as I remind my Christian friends all the time, is a Jew. And we are all Christians are from a Jew, if you will. And I just don't see how we can stand by. Is there anything that can be done to fire up the Christian community and remind them that we all come from a Jew? I'm sorry.
Well, I don't really get that deep into it, but I'll talk about religion with any Christian, and I will, like I said, I'll do talks and podcasts and interviews just about anywhere, churches, synagogues, even a mosque that would invite me if it's with the proper in the proper scenario. I mean, I'll talk to anybody about it. But yeah, I need my Christian brethren to help support the cause. So if anybody here or in my next talk or presentation or podcast has a person or a place for me to continue the message, then I would be grateful. And slowly but surely, then we'll be aligned. And I think we are. It's just trying to get people to think straight. And no, the Judeo-Christian values, as a good friend of mine calls it, are still intact. And like most people are law-abiding, hardworking, family-loving, and I'm going with that. I'm trying to keep this optimistic in an otherwise dark world, and it will. I think it's going to get better, but it's going to take time.
All right, now, Doug, you can make your second comment or question.
If your dad had not done the run, the multiple escapes, and had the perseverance, you wouldn't even be here.
I couldn't say that better myself, and I say that a lot. I'm lucky to be here. My dad was lucky to survive, and it's just that's so poignant that there's nothing much to add onto it, except to say that if the United States had freed Hungary rather than the communists, I wouldn't be here either. I'd be in Hungary, raised in hopefully a democratic and free country. And these poor people for 100 years had to tolerate and not only World War II and the communists, but after World War I, they had Horthy in charge. He was not Jewish friendly. They had the Red Terror, they had the White Terror. You needed a program to know who the leadership was, but you didn't need a program to know how is this going to adversely affect the Jewish people, because that's how they felt for 30, 50 years. And even when we went to visit in the 70s, when I was in high school with my parents, I didn't really appreciate it at the time, but a lot of memories of flashbacks since doing this project, since doing this book, seeing why my dad cried when he took me to his apartment that he used to live in with his parents, and looking down out the window at the street. And I can't imagine the emotions and the memories that he had then. But I didn't see my dad cry often, but that was something. And of course, they went to all the grave sites and paid respects to family that had passed, that had been in the country. And now I appreciate it. So it's just such a great point. And yes, I wouldn't be here. Lucky to be here. It's another appreciative thought. And I wouldn't be an American if it wasn't for the communists taking over Hungary, and for many, many decades.
And perhaps all the things that you did as a doctor wouldn't have happened either.
Probably not. I mean, if I was lucky, I could have gotten into a radiology or whatever specialty I would have done in Hungary, if depending on the competition. When I say my dad finally got into medical school, there were so many people killed in Hungary, and a lot of them were doctors, a lot of them were professionals. So Hungary had a major shortage of doctors after World War II, and they actually had a quota that no more than 10% of the medical students could be Jewish. But fortunately, my dad was qualified and smart enough to be able to get in, and therefore he finished and then did his residency. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff that comes in place that makes you think how circumstances could change by a matter of minutes. I mean, his second escape, we're talking about a matter of seconds. Timing, luck, brains, courage, miracles, and I like to think the hand of God.
Well, tell us about the second escape. Well, when
Okay.
they escaped for the first time, how long were they out before they got found?
They weren't out that long. They made it to Budapest, and then some truck driver, he double crossed them. He literally double crossed them. He said, "I'll take you where you need to go. Let me get you." And he took them where the prisoners were corralled. They called it the dog pound. So they were betrayed, and so they weren't going to stand it very much. Either kill me now or I'm getting out of here. And cigarettes actually saved their life. His friend Frank, who was I guess a smoker according to my dad, but I've met his daughter through this project, and I hope to meet her live. She's actually in Los Angeles. So she said that she didn't know that her dad had ever smoked. He became an architect, by the way. But no, because of cigarettes, they wanted to give some of the leaders. They were corralled in this dog pound, which was literally across the street from Nazi headquarters in Budapest. And they went to the main desk, and they were looking for something to read. So my dad promised that he would find them something to read, because they had all this junk piled up and there was nothing to read. But my dad was a big bluffer, and he found a comic. I found an American comic book, and his friend Frank had a pack of cigarettes. and they went over to the main lobby, the main desk, where they were corralled, and they gave it to the mucky mucks, and that was their chance. They planned it out like the day before, and then once they gave them their little gifts, out the door they went, literally out the front door in front of Nazi headquarters. Lucky there was a train there. What do you call it in San Francisco? The tram, or the streetcar. So streetcar right there between circulating guards, major luck, major timing, on the train and gone. And so that was their second. Two more escapes from communist Hungary, which hopefully you'll learn about. Fascinating, even arguing with armed Russian soldiers, cloak and dagger stories, like I said, hiding places you wouldn't expect, clothes he had to wear. But I'll tell you this, he even missed an escape. My dad missed an escape under communist Hungary. He went to the wrong train station. He felt like the unluckiest guy in the world. And everybody who made that train got arrested by the communists, including his medical school roommate. So the luck on this guy, they talk about the luck of the Irish. We'll talk about the luck of the Jewish. I'll say it's the luck of my dad. And again, I go back to he was really guided by the hand of God, exceptionally motivated to be free, but lucky he was smart and had the courage. And his risk tolerance, you can feel it goes up and up and up throughout his lifetime. The risk tolerance, it's unreal. And it's just about survival. You didn't think about anything but surviving.
All right, and the last question. Okay, we have Mike Milstein, and then the last question I saw Janice's hand first, so that we go to Janice and then Mike Milstein.
So please tell us the story of how your father ended up in the United States, specifically, for those who don't know, the same town that my husband's family lived in, Mount Clemens, Michigan, where my father-in-law's family lived for many years. As I understand it, there was only one synagogue, and my mother-in-law was also a Hungarian Holocaust survivor. And I wish they were alive so we could figure out how well they knew each other. But I'd love to hear how your family ended up in America, and specifically Mount Clemens.
Well, I remember the Litvin family. I think they were quite a bit, well, not quite a bit, a little bit older than I was, because I was a late birth, because they weren't going to have me in communist Hungary. They wanted to wait till they were established and free. But yeah, they ironically, after the book ends in Vienna, where they're finally in the free country, and we want to do part two. We might want to do a sequel. But my parents were in Vienna. Then they ended up in Germany, ironically, and took an American boat, and had a lot of Hungarian friends that had children that were allowed to fly in military planes because they had kids. But since my parents had no kids, they had to be on a boat. So they left on Christmas. So they were on this boat for most of January in the northern Atlantic, leaky hull, nausea. My dad he had seasickness most of the way. Even the ship's captain said he'd never seen weather that bad that time of year. Ended up in New York City. Then they had to get they met my mom's father, who had already been divorced and got remarried. He was from Providence, Rhode Island at that time. That divorce was to save the family name. It wasn't for any personal reason. They got a divorce to save the family name. Anyway, he greets them at Ellis Island. They go through their paperwork. They have a flat tire, which is how I wanted to end the book, because I would have just laughed because I look at a flat tire. For us in Florida, you're on a highway or somewhere, flat tire. Oh, it's a major inconvenience. For them, it was nothing. So flat tire, no AAA then, but they get that done. Very uncomfortable. They were in Providence for a while. Didn't speak English, didn't have work. My mom hadn't seen her father in 18 years. Finally, my dad gets his residency in OBGYN while he's taking English classes, high school English in Boston. He got into the Beth Israel, which is a Harvard affiliate, very esteemed. I couldn't get into the Beth Israel in any specialty, so that's something too. No job market in the late 50s in Boston, so he moved to Detroit. Met a lot of great people in Detroit, Eastern European and otherwise. Big support system. And then he felt the urban blight coming up in the 60s, and he got a great job offer in Mount Clemens, so he moved there. Delivered 10,000 babies, plus did surgery. He would have worked till the day he died. You're right about the Jewish community there in the west, in the west side of Detroit, a big flourishing Jewish community. In our side, the only synagogue in Macomb County, about 100 Jewish families. It's almost gone now. There's very few Jewish people left. Although when I went back last year, I think they were picking up some more people, which I was glad to see. But they have a Christian part of their congregation too, which is really cool. So Yes, my parents were very well liked and established in the Jewish community and the medical community as they educated and as they spread culture and love. And
So exactly what year did they arrive in Mount Clemens?
Mount Clemens, 1965. When my mom passed
Okay.
away, I sold that house in 2017. So they lived in
Okay.
the same place for over 50 years.
Wow. Thank you. That's helpful.
And last question from Mike Middlestein, then
Well,
I'll
I
ask
just,
Robert for a concluding thought.
I just have am I muted? Let's see here.
No,
we can hear
we
you.
can hear you, Mike.
You can hear me. Okay. This reminds me of my grandparents' story from Vilnius, Lithuania, where they were born and raised. And my grandfather was drafted in the army, and at the time was the Russian-Sino War, which meant certain death for Jews back in the day. And somehow they were able to bribe one of the guards, and they arranged a horse-drawn carriage and made it to Leeds, England, and eventually to the United States. So I am very grateful that they were able to get by and get over there. And I congratulate you for what you're doing, and keep up the good work.
Thank you
All
for
right,
saying-
wonderful. All right, well, thank you very much. And do you have a concluding thought for us, Dr. Wolf?
I do. What Michael said resonates well. Anybody that has a story similar,
Get them.
we get it done. Let's help share the stories, because everybody has a story. History is destined to repeat itself, but it shouldn't, at least not the negative aspect of it. And we've talked about that already, that what's happened in the past is sort of happening now. Let's put it away, and let's not let it go into the future. Let's keep a normal, peaceful, free world with tolerance, education, and freedom of speech and religion.
Well, thank you, and thank you all for joining us. I hope to see you next week when we will hear from Marshall Terrell about Elvis and the Colonel. So with that, thank you, Janice. Thank you, Pete. Thank you for everyone who helps out making the meetings run. And of course, we appreciate your loyalty to the Golden Gate Breakfast Club. And see you next week. Thank you, Pete. Thank you, Dr. Wolf.
Thanks,
We
Dr.
really
Wolf.
appreciate
Thank you.
Thank you for
Thank
having
you.
me.
Thank you.